Yeah, I'm glad I made it. I had a flight, wasn't able to get out of town yesterday with the rain and the freezing and all that sort of stuff. So I got on a flight at 6 o'clock this morning, and I was able to get here on time. So we didn't have to change up the schedule, and that was good. And it's certainly great to be here again and to come out to the work that Danny has done over the past 6 years. Every time I come out, it seems more relevant than ever, this conference that we have, especially considering what's happening across the country economically, what's happening across the country politically. And thank you, John, for all the work that you've done to keep this conference going and create it. So I'm looking forward to chatting with you today, talking about the pension Ponzi was the name of the book that I had. And it took us a lot of places. I got interested in it in regards to what I was doing professionally, working as an employee benefits and doing some consulting on pensions. I was in the industrial heartland of Canada, which was Ontario at that time. We started to see legacy pensions, which were the pensions and employee costs from the large companies. There was auto companies, there was airlines, there was steel companies, and they were all starting to get into pretty severe financial situation because of what they were calling legacy costs, which was the cost of the benefits and the pensions that they were offering to their employees. And I looked at that and I thought about it and I said, I wonder what the situation looks like in the government. And because I knew from my practice that somebody in the private sector getting a pension, it was going to be better than still, 80% of the rest of the population that was never going to have a pension. But compared to the public sector pensions, they were, they paled in comparison. And sure enough, when I looked into the public sector pension situation, it was a mess. They offered giant pensions. Ian was alluding to some of them. We looked at TTC. Somebody said, what's happening at TTC? We can't seem to control costs at the city. We looked at the top 10 Toronto Transit Commission, the TTC pensions, and the top guy was going to be retiring on $240,000 a year for the rest of his life. And the next 10 guys down had giant pensions, and once we did a calculation on the life expectancy of those, they were going to be paying out $36 million to the top 10 guys never to work again. One of the things that's happening with the life expectancies, Ian once again did an excellent presentation on demographics, which truly is our future. Mentioned age 89. The public sector is already there. Somebody with a public sector pension's living on average about 5 years longer than somebody who's in the private sector and being out of the employee benefits. I thought, gee, why is that? Looked at it and we saw that most health problems are related to stress they're finding, and most stress is related to financial situations. So that somebody that's retiring, a police officer, for example, is retiring at age 52 on an average pension of about $70,000 a year now for the rest of his life. There's not going to be much stress there. And so that's sort of how I got started on the book and where I went from there. And there was a big interest in it, had some great support. Catherine Swift, who is the head of the CFIB, the Canadian Federation of Business, for years. She gave me a lot of input into the book, actually came up with the title of our book, which was called Pension Ponzi. It was a fun job writing it. It did become a bestseller, but despite that, my co-author and myself, he was an award-winning writer with the Globe and Mail. We figured we made about 60 cents an hour. Should have been an American book. We would have been able to, make the 10 times the amount. And so we got that book out and got a lot of interest in it at a time that there seemed to be huge pension shortfalls, a lot of problems funding these pensions, and we basically brought awareness to the public sector debacle. As people started to hear about the pensions and putting out information, the CFIB was a strong supporter, put out lots of information on it. The Canadian Taxpayers Federation picked it up as a fundraiser for their organization, went out to speak to the Fraser Institute and other concerned public policy think tanks, just because Canadians were blissfully unaware of what was going on in pensions. I would suggest they probably still are today, and just not clear on what the situation was. So it, took us a lot of places, to the finance committees in the House of Commons several times, to various Senate committees, to being in front of all sorts of MPs and MPPs, city councils. We got kicked out of one city council in Cambridge. They said, "Oh, do we want to talk about the OMERS pension?" And they looked around the table, and 4 or 5 guys said, "Oh, there's a conflict of interest here. We're all collecting pensions." And so they said, "No, we don't want to hear you. Get out of here." And went out to Newfoundland as well, and was invited out to the Newfoundland Board of Trade. They said, "We've got a referral from Tom Marshall." He was the premier out there, a great big giant bear of a guy with a wonderful handshake, and he said, "I want you to come out and tell the business community what's going on with pensions. I've read your book." He said he read it 2 times, but I don't think he had that much time to read it. But I went out and spoke with the Board of Trade, and they were trying to determine what the heck's going on with pensions. Why? The auditor came out and said 60% of the debt of the province, which we see is basically, I think it is bankrupt. It's certainly insolvent. And 60% of that was related to these underfunded pensions and employee benefits liabilities. I'd like to talk with Ian later about why other provinces don't seem to be putting those numbers onto their books, but they were certainly aware of it. And so that's where we got started, and worked on it for quite a while. Didn't seem to get anywhere. Just lots of people were interested. Sun News was a great supporter. We were, on many times with all the different hosts that they had. It's a real sad loss for Canada that we no longer have the Sun News network. Rebel's doing a great job picking up on them, and I'm happy to see there are some. What's the opposite of fake news? I don't know, truth news maybe. Reality, yeah, that's it. We'll call it reality TV. I like that. And so we said, well, gee, so we picked up a quote from Milton Friedman that sort of described what the challenge was on pensions. I can't read it from this direction. I probably didn't need to put it up there, but it was basically about what he called the tyranny of the status quo. That's continuing to go on and on and on the way we are without making the changes that are needed. He said the only time that changes are ever going to come in society are when there's a crisis or when there's a perceived crisis. And at that time, society is going to look for the solutions, and it's our responsibility as an organization that we had set up called Fair Pensions for All to have those solutions ready and at hand for when the changes need to come. Just looking at what's happening, last year we featured the university pensions in Alberta. They have a huge underfunded shortfall. The underfunded shortfall is about $440,000 per active university member. That $440,000 is money that taxpayers are going to have to kick into that pension in order to make good on the promises that have been made to those university employees in that system. And that compares to the average Canadian who has an RSP, with the average RSP in the range of about $60,000. Let's look at this one here. The Heritage Trust Fund, it was set up to try and capture the wealth of the province over the long term, put it away as a rainy day bank account when there was no more pipelines with oil in them, or there was no diversification in the economy, and we needed to do something to rely on. Back in a decade ago, in 2007, the Heritage Trust Fund had $16.3 billion in it. The Alberta teachers' pension had $4.3 billion in it. There was some debate about where the money went and whether there was a shortfall of the money that had been put in, but today we update it to 2008. We see the Heritage Fund still is not growing, but the teachers' pension plan now has $16.6 billion in it. Where does that money come from? The average teacher's pension, this is off their annual pension report, shows that there's 41,746 active teachers. And that's how they base contributions on the active employees that are working. They pay a contribution that's called their employee contribution, and the taxpayer puts in the employer contribution. And today, $11,000 comes in from what they call a special payment from taxpayers because the pension's too short to make good on the promises that have already been made. The government kicks in, another $9,400, and teachers themselves, they put in another $10,000. So every year, for every working teacher in Alberta, there's $31,000 going into that pension plan. Compare that to the average worker for, Alberta. What does that teacher's pension look like? Right now, the average pension is $32,422. But teachers also qualify for an additional payment on their old age security and CPP. And that tops up another $20,000. So that's $53,000 that the average teacher is earning today, assuming they've got full CPP and full OAS. And that includes all the teachers that are in the plan. So there's teachers that are over 100. There's teachers that are 90 and they've been collecting on this pension for 40 years. There's lots and lots and lots that have been collecting for 30 years already. So that the real number that I'm interested in would be what would be the average pension that's put out today for somebody who's newly retired, including the OAS and their pension. They're probably in the range of about $65,000. The average age is 58 when they retire, and they'll be collecting that for the rest of their lives. The Alberta median income over age 65 is $29,100. So that means half of Albertans over the age of 65 are earning less than $29,100. This came off a Stats Canada report that I think it was 2016 numbers. I'm sure they haven't changed much since then. So you can see that how lucrative these public sector pensions are. Here are the top 4 pensions in the province of Alberta. The LAP pension, that's the municipal pensions. What are they for the city's $44 billion inside of that pension plan. The public service pension plan, which is just general public sector employees, has another 13.9. The teacher's pension has $16.6 billion in it, and the universities have $4.6 billion. So over our book came out in 2011, and so we worked on it for a long time. We were working on bringing the issues of pensions to the forefront, describing it in front of all sorts of politicians and people that were concerned about it. For some reason, the unions never invited us to talk about it. And so we were trying to, get awareness of it. And I think we did a good job of awareness on one aspect of the work that we had done. In 2001, you can see there the first chart. The orange chart is the public sector pensions for all of Canada, including municipal, provincial, and federal, compared to RRSPs. And so those assets were about $400 billion at that time. And they started to grow. I think the thing that we made governments aware of was just the serious situation that pensions were in, and unions pressed hard in order to get additional increases and contributions into those pension plans. And so that today we have $1.2 billion for public sector employees in assets, $1.2 billion, which is the total value of the public sector pensions for about 2.9 government workers. I'm sorry, 2.9 million. And the RRSPs are at about the same level. And that's over 5 million Canadians. So you can see what the relative values are for somebody who's worked for government, somebody who's saved on their own into an RRSP. And then not included on there, I should have put another line that would have gone to the roof. That's the 9 million Canadians that have no pension, that have no RSP, that are going to be relying strictly on CPP and old age security. How is that for scary demographics that Ian's been telling us about. How are they going to survive, even on that $29,000 a year median income? So half of the seniors are under that level, and they're trying to rely on CPP and old age security. The CPP is the only one that's sort of been pre-funded. The old age security is a pay-as-you-go, so it's paid out of annual revenues, and then there's another income supplement that brings the guaranteed for seniors age 65 up to about $18,000 a year for total pay-as-you-go pension sources. When we first started writing in 2001, what was the first year that the baby boomers turned age 65? And about 4 years ago, every day in Canada, there's 1,000 people a day turning age 65. They were born in 1946, and every day there's going to be at least 1,000 seniors a day turning age 65 for another almost 20 years. So you can see how we can quickly get up to those numbers where we've got, two working people for every senior, and that dependency rate, and some of the challenges that we're going to face. The public sector is obviously going to be okay with those assets that they've accumulated. I don't know how the average Canadian on a RRSP of average of about 65 is gonna get by, but what are we gonna do with the other 9 million Canadians that have absolutely nothing and are relying on your pay-as-you-go programs when you see the economic prospects, in large part because of that demographic trend that's happening. We're not going to be seeing, the sorts of GDP growth that we've seen over the last couple of decades, and at the same time struggling to stay ahead with health costs and those other programs that are going out to seniors. This is an overview of the total retirement assets in Canada. That first blue line, $340 billion for the CPP, which is the Canada Pension Plan. The Quebec Pension Plan has about $70 billion in it. The total overall pension assets for Canada are about 1.5. Is that what that's going into? 1.7, and that includes the private sector pension plans that are out there as well. The people that do have private sector pension plans, typically they're not going to be a defined benefit final income. They're going to be a defined contribution, but for the laws and regulations, they've been put under that pension asset category, and so that the ones that do have the gold-plated pension plans, the government pension plans, have 1.2, and then that compares to the total RRSPs. You had a question there?
Can you talk into the mic? We're having issues.
I'm sorry. Is that not loud enough? I'm just a little dry from my airplane flight, I think. Thank you for pointing that out. And I have some cold water, and it constricts my laryngitis. Thank you. And here's the trend on pension plans. This points out the gold-plated pension plans, which are plans that are paid out based on a final average salary. And typically it's a final average 5 years of working that you get to, and that's going to be the compensation that you will be paid. The public sector government employees have grown up to 2.9 million that are going to be collecting government pensions. And in the private sector, those gold-plated plans that we call are only 400,000. So you can see that's sort of the discrepancy between the private sector, the public sector. In the UK, where they've got some challenging pension plans problems over there, they're calling that the pension apartheid. And so that there hasn't really been any solid attempts at any pension reform anywhere. A little bit of, dibbling and dabbling here, but nothing really strong. When I went out to see the Premier of Newfoundland, he said, "You better sit down with my deputy finance minister," or the Minister of Finance at that point in time. And he had a deputy that was, sort of leading up the meeting, who had obviously been around for a long, long time, knew all the things that the the minister should know about. And when we started getting into the pensions, all of a sudden she was pounding her, fist on the table. This can't be right. You're full of, that stuff they ship out from Alberta for our fertilizer. And so there hasn't really been any solid work done on pension reform at all. There was a chance on Alberta a few years ago. It may have been in about 2012. There was a finance minister, Horner, who actually looked at it. And he said, you know what, this could be a problem. Let's at least investigate the problem and see, what we can find out. So he asked for solicitations from across the public sector, who, of course, all these pension funds are managed by the unions and by the think tanks and various other organizations that were involved with pensions. And he had an excellent, comprehensive website that included about 20 or 30 proposals and presentations that were put together by the pension industry right across the spectrum. And we were watching this quite excitedly. However, there became some turbulent political things happening, and we got a change of government at that time. And I regret severely not having saved all that information that had gone up on the website, because when the new premier came in, within 2 weeks, bang, all of that information was gone and wiped out, and there was no further discussion about what was happening. What's the slide before that one there? And at that point in time, they had investigated it. The Treasury Board had done an investigation to see what they thought the liabilities actually were, and the pension shortfall was estimated at $40 billion. But take in mind that was using private sector accounting. There's special accounting for pensions that are in the public sector that we like to call voodoo accounting, which says there can never be a pension shortfall because taxpayers are always going to be there to pay these things into infinity. So it's sort of unnecessary to look at what private sector accounting might provide us for shortfalls on these pensions.
So is the LAPP the cities?
Local administration pension plans, so cities and municipalities, LAP pension. And, okay. So here's what the public sector pension contributions have looked like since we started our business back in 2001. We had about $8 billion a year. Once we told everybody there was a huge shortfall in pensions, they increased contributions up to $40 billion a year that are going into pensions, into the public sector pensions at all levels, once again, municipal, provincial, federal. And that compares to the budgets of Newfoundland, Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, and PEI. That's more than the combined provincial spending of all four of those provinces by about $15 billion. So that shows you just how huge it is and just how much money has gone into these things, and just, we at least got rid of the pension problem for the public sector. There's no more shortfalls anymore with that type of money flowing into it. One of the things that were sort of got on the radar, haven't really got solidly into it, and I had a few questions today on CPP. I've sort of gotten away from the pension issues as there hasn't been a whole lot of take up on it. We know the numbers inside and out once we sat down, and if we were actually to look at them, I've been a little bit more involved with a few, watching a few political things that came to our organization. I was fortunate enough to be asked by Drew Barnes to help out on some campaigns with him and watch what was happening in Alberta. I had worked a little bit with the finance minister in Ontario on his political campaigns, but sort of strayed away a little bit from the CPP. But one of the things that's happening with the CPP, we saw that $330 billion in assets that it has. So some people have raised concerns about what the cost of managing that money is. In my opinion, all of any of these public sector pensions and union pensions and the government pensions should all just be invested in what we call passive investments. They should be just invested in ETF type investments that are just solid, constant rate of returns. But the pension fund managers and the politicians have started to become very political with these pensions. The Ontario Teachers Pension Plan, one of the biggest in Canada, one of the biggest in the world, it's actively investing so that it combined with another Ontario pension plan are the biggest real estate holders in Ontario. How much, of that $1 trillion of investment assets that they have, how much of our provincial debt do they own? We can see what the provincial debt numbers are, and it sort of becomes sort of an incestuous type cycle. Well, we can't afford to pay you more money, but if you buy our bonds inside of your pension funds, maybe we can work with you a little bit. And the CPP plan itself is invested in its active investments outside of Canada. About 85% of them are outside of Canada, buying infrastructure. What do they like to own? They like to own, they own pensions. Canadian Pensions owns the Chilean water system. They like to get into monopoly regulated situations where they can get much higher rates of return because their friends in government are mandating what those rates are going to be, and they will be getting significant returns on that. They own airports throughout Europe. They own power distribution. They own water distribution, public utilities. They own large parts of the communications industry. It was interesting. I saw a union strike out on the East Coast somewhere, and the QP workers were out over a situation that had happened with one of their employees. They were out there with their signs and chanting and rushing all around, and it was the TD Bank that they were protesting about. And I said, that's interesting, because I know that their pension funds like to own these banks. And sure enough, the number 3 holding in their pension fund was the TD Bank, the very one that they were protesting about. The union members seem to be completely oblivious about where their investments are, where they're going, and it's the union bosses who like to run the system. In Canada, public sector unions have about 3.2 million employees. They each pay about $1,000 a year in union dues. That's $3.2 billion. $3.2 billion that are flowing into in public sector labor unions. We had a chance. Harper had brought in a disclosure bill that was going to require them to disclose to the public where they spent their money. One of the first things that Trudeau did was rescinded that law, so that we still don't know today where $3.2 billion of that money's going. I'm sure a lot of it's recycled through some of the American foundations that are finding their way back into Alberta, and they're holding up our pipelines. Oh. We can see all the activism that they've done over the past few years. Recently, they've started to clean it up quite a bit. Okay, thank you. I should have had my clock out there, but and one of the things that we're watching with the investment with the pensions is this was a Montreal. It was called the Montreal Pledge. And what it said was that pension funds need to get on board with the UN Agenda 2030. And they need to start investing their money to help out to save our country, save the world, because the world is ending in 2030. Michelle Sterling is here today, and she'll probably tell us how many times the UN has warned that the world is coming to an end already.
You might say it's a Montreal Carbon Pledge.
They meant Montreal Carbon Pledge. So these pensions, there was $10 trillion listed on there. Now they have a new a program for responsible investing, the PRI, which is starting to bring all the pensions across the world, so that now they've got an organization. You can see there, the first circle is two organizations from the United Nations. There's 1,900 pensions and investment companies that have gone on board to commit to invest towards Agenda 2030 issues. They've got $70 trillion. That $70 trillion is 70 times the size of 35 times the size of the Canadian economy. So it's huge. So they've started to focus on pension funds as a way to produce the revenue that they're going to need for these issues. Next. And one of the things that the CPP is now an activist investor. They bought a $2 billion Mumbai low-income housing operation. How much return do should Canadians expect to get back on that? And they've started to actually create green bonds to fund the Agenda 2030 and what they call the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals. I always thought pensions bought bonds, but in this situation, they're starting to produce them. And so as we've gone through and looked at the pension situation, spoken to politicians, and took our show around the country and through the media, there always seemed to be a gap. Nobody was at the table ever supporting the taxpayers. When we went to Newfoundland, for example, they said, we don't understand why there's zero budging from the sitting MHAs, the members of the House Assembly, on the pension issue. We did a quick look, and 50% of the MHAs, equivalent to an MLA here in Alberta, were already collecting one pension from their previous work. The government politics has largely been infiltrated by the unions, and you'd be surprised if you looked at how many politicians have come out of the public sector. They're there to protect their interests, and in the situation with Newfoundland, they were already collecting one pension. They were going on to collect a second very lucrative pension as an MHA. So that's sort of an update on what's happening. I'd be happy to ask, we've got about 2 minutes for questions. Yes?
You were going to say about the commissions that are being paid on the active investments in CPP?
Excellent point. When I brought that up, the public sector pensions across the board pay about 35 basis points to manage that. So on that $1 trillion, the management fees are coming out about $5 billion a year. Currently on the CPP, with 1/3 the amount of assets are coming out at $5 billion. So our finance minister has gotten very wealthy off of the pension industry. Through his pension consultation, and it's from the results that I've seen from our current finance minister, I wonder if he's working for himself and his his consultant company, or the government of Canada.
If you speak up, we'll take your question. We've got one more question.
What's your solution?
Back to the Milton Friedman tyranny of the status quo, until there's a point that people realize just how bad and how serious the situation is. Nobody will be able to step forth and do anything about it. We're starting to see that happen around the world. Rob Ford in Ontario, he was a nobody until 3 months before the election. He stepped in aggressively. People latched onto him, and he became the premier. Huge populist movement here in Alberta swept in Notley as well, although she was on the left side, and we're seeing that right across the globe, populism rising, and a lot of it's based on the issues of globalism, and it's coming to Canada. We're going to see some yellow vest candidates running in the next election, and to split off from Bernier. We'll see how he's going to impact the situation, but Macron over in France, it was nine months, he was the finance minister of the socialist government of France. He split away, and 9 months later, he became the president of the country. So it shows you just how quickly things are moving in politics when they've identified somebody who's become a populist leader and their ability to get into power. But even the populists, once they get into power, if they don't have those solutions or ideas handy, like Notley, it can turn out to be just a disaster.
Bill, just stay here, Bill. Thank you very much, Bill. Give him a warm thanks for that. And we actually have